Good morning, everybody. Welcome to Grace. We're so thrilled that you could join us. Hope you're doing well. First, if you are giving this morning, you can do that online, e-transfer. You can come live. We'd love to have you. And if you're watching this and been following along, we'd love to reach out to you or for you to reach out to us and fill out a Connect card. And you can do that online through the website. It's right at the top of the screen. A few notes. The ornament exchange is coming up. We do an ornament exchange every year. It's for the women. It's Tuesday, December 6th, 7 p.m. If you want to be a part of this, you need to connect with Rach, my wife, and her email is rach.albano@gmail.com, rach.albano@gmail.com. And you can let her know that you want to be a part of the ornament exchange, and you'll be paired with someone. You'll buy an ornament for them, even if you don't know them, and then it's an exchange on the night of, and there'll be drinks and snacks and things ready for you. And so if you'd like to be a part of that, you're a woman, you're welcome to come. Reach out to Rach. And then lastly, there's a refresh that's coming up this Friday, and we'd love for you to be a part of that, November 25th. And we'll be doing worship and prayer here at the church. And it's been a really encouraging time. So if you'd like to come, it's free form. It's not super programmed. I'd love for you to come and seek God with us. This morning we have Catherine who's speaking. And we haven't done a live recording. And so what we want you to know is that later at 12 o'clock, we will be releasing a live recording of Catherine's sermon from this morning. But what you're about to hear and not see, just hear, it's audio of a preach Catherine did last year. And so hope you enjoy that. And if you're looking for this morning's message, it will be following at 12 online here, as well as Apple Podcast and as well on our website. Thanks for joining.
Good morning. My name is Catherine Clausen, and I am a third building gracer. If you don't know what that means, you might be a one building gracer. So it's exciting to me that soon there will also be people that are like, we were in the building when it was smaller, and then you will be a second building gracer of some sort too. So I just wanted to introduce myself. For those of you I haven't had a chance to meet, so many new people have been coming that I feel really behind on that. But I've been coming here for over 9 years. I love being a part of this community. And if you haven't heard me share before, there are certain things that I'm really passionate about. Surprise, still passionate about them. The first is I really love to talk about loving the Lord with all my mind. That's really important to me. I became a Christian at 19 through the ministry of the local Presbyterian church in Fergus. And then I went off to Hillsong for a couple of years, did some Bible school there. And then I had all of these questions about how does all of this work? And a lot of people didn't like them until I found myself dropped in a Christian philosophy class. And I felt like I found my home. And since then, I have continually been caught up in wonder and enjoyment and in worship when I just think about the wisdom and the knowledge of God. All the things that he knows. Can you just think of all the things that he knows? So I'm a doctoral student, and we're always like finding these rabbit holes of knowledge that you didn't know existed, but then you have to learn them to talk about them. But God already knows all of those things. It's incredible to me. But connected to this, something really dear to my heart, is talking about and demonstrating that the Christian faith is rich and deep and robust intellectually. I am not part of a faith that requires me to check my brain at the door, and I appreciate that. So if you've heard me speak before, today might be a little bit different. I'm not going to talk about logical fallacies, although I still love to talk about those too, if you want to talk to me about them after. But this morning, here's some questions that I want you to keep in the back of your mind as I'm talking. Has God ever intervened in your life, but in a few weeks you forgot about it? Have you ever looked at someone else and their experience of God in their life and felt disappointment, confusion, even jealousy at your lack of his intervention in your life? Have you ever been overwhelmed with the suffering of the world and you just couldn't see how God would make it right? These are the things that I want you to keep in the back of your mind today. Of course, as a philosopher, I had to ask myself, what am I trying to convince you of? Because this is what we do. We make arguments, and I try and persuade you, my thesis, if you will. My thesis this morning is I hope to convince you that to encounter Jesus is to encounter his faithfulness. Okay, so it's kind of a low bar, but maybe not for some. Maybe not, you want someone to convince you of that. Maybe you're waiting for those reasons to be convinced of that. So whether it's a low bar and I have a sure success with you because you're already sure of it, that's great. Let me remind you. But if not, I hope today that you can grab a hold of that. So more specifically, not just faithfulness blanket statement, but I think that the Bible demonstrates, writes about, catalogs experiences of Jesus' faithfulness in two main ways. The first is that he is faithful to complete his work on earth. Jesus had a mission, and in him we see God returning to his people, setting aright the problem of sin and death by way of the cross. Jesus is faithful to solve the Adam problem that marred God's good creation, and to initiate the redemption of all things. Jesus Christ is faithful to his mission to renew the created world. He is faithful. So that is the first idea of faithfulness I want to talk about. The second one I think we're a little bit more familiar with. He's faithful to his people, us as individuals. When people encounter Jesus in the Gospels, he shows himself faithful in his care and concern for them. And this is what he does for us today. That he knows us, that he's committed to us, that he's concerned for us. Jesus Christ is faithful. So specifically, the story I want to work from today is found in Luke 7. I'll give you a second to get there. I'm going to start by reading the passage, Luke 7, 11 to 17. Then I'm going to go through the context, what we know about the context of this passage, and then I'm going to take the story from different vantage points of the people involved. So let's start by reading this together. Luke 7, 11 to 17. Everybody there? Okay. Soon afterward, he went to a town called Nain, and his disciples and a great crowd went with him. As he drew near to the gate of the town, behold, a man who had died was being carried out, the only son of his mother, and she was a widow, and a considerable crowd from the town was with her. And when the Lord saw her, he had compassion on her, and said to her, "Do not weep." Then he came up and touched the bier, and the bearers stood still. And he said, "Young man, I say to you, arise." And the dead man sat up and began to speak, and Jesus gave him to his mother. Fear seized them all, and they glorified God, saying, "A great prophet has risen among us, and God has visited his people." And this report about him spread through the whole of Judea and all the surrounding country. So that's our home base for today. To give you an idea of where this shows up in the Gospel of Luke, earlier in Luke, Jesus had already referenced the story of Elijah raising the widow's son. So he'd already kind of mentioned this idea that they would be familiar with. And Luke, in his writing, couples his stories. I think Mike has mentioned before that he would give an example of a male-centered story and then one of female. So right before this story, there's the story of the centurion slave. And then now we have the widow's son. The common denominator here is the healing of a young man. So this is a conscious pairing that Luke does as he writes. He does this repeatedly in his gospel account. And then we look and see that the large crowd is afraid and they glorify God. They proclaim Jesus as a great prophet, saying that he looks favorably on his people. And this is drawing from what Zechariah, John the Baptist's dad, said earlier in Luke. And this is drawing on times when Zechariah said it, of Yahweh's significant visitation to his people. So here, this passage is drawing from a lot of different things. So later on, when you keep reading in this section of Luke, you'll also see reference to the book of Isaiah, the dead are raised, eyes are opened, again, drawing from this idea that a great visitation of God on his people. So that's a larger context of our story today. But a closer look at what's happening in this passage, because there's a lot packed in here. So think about, for a widow to lose her only son, for him to die before she does, is considered extremely tragic. It left her dependent on public charity for support unless she had other relatives or means. This is because of the Levirate law. This is based in the Old Testament. A woman's social and financial connections came to her through the men in her life. Started with her father. She was her father's daughter. That's how she entered society, was cared for. Then she went to her husband's home, joined his family. That's how she was cared for. That was her social connection. Then it was through her sons. Her sons would take in their wives into her home, their home together. That was her social and financial well-being through the men in her life. Now she is without any of that. This leaves her exposed to poverty, marginalization, isolation. This is very tragic. People customarily dropped what they were doing when a funeral procession would go by. If they would see it happening, they would join in support. According to the custom, the mother would walk in front of the bier, which was a stretcher that the body was laid on. So it makes sense that Jesus would meet her first, because she was out front. But interrupting a funeral was a blatant breach of Jewish custom. People were like, what is he doing? And even to get that close was very unusual. Only the closest to the deceased were expected to get that close because it exposed them to uncleanliness, being unclean. Although the young men probably hadn't been dead long, it was custom to wash, anoint, wrap, mourn, and bury them as quickly as possible to avoid odor. So he wasn't in a casket. His body was laying on this stretcher as they carried it. In Jewish custom, touching this bier, this stretcher, just the wood, exposed somebody to a day's uncleanness, ritual impurity. Touching the body itself would be a week. And this was the most severe form of ritual impurity in Judaism. So it's seen as a very big deal. To be unclean, I don't know if you're familiar with that term. You read a lot about it in the Old Testament. It's not necessarily a moral judgment. It has those connotations. However, it did restrict you from involvement in the synagogue. It was largely for sanitary health reasons, but it restricted you from being involved in your religion. And people wouldn't want to interact with you in case they also became unclean from interacting with you. But in Jesus' case, the influence goes the other way. When he touches that young man, it's his holiness that spreads, not the young man's uncleanness. It's his cleanness that spreads to the young man, raises him from the dead. I read in a commentary that the philosophers of the day would say things to the bereaved like, do not grieve, for it will do no good. Which to me was like, so we've documented philosophers saying weird things for a long time, which is unfortunate. But instead of saying something like that, Jesus does say, do not grieve, but not just because it won't do any good, because he raises the son. He takes away the cause of the bereavement, not just says, oh, it won't do anything. So with this larger context in mind, I want to look at what it would have been like if you were there. In philosophy, we have a lot of interesting thought experiments. And one thing we ask, there's actually papers written on what's it like to be a bat? And the thing is you don't know. All you know is what is it like for a human to think that they're trying to be a bat? And sometimes I think of that when I come to a scripture. I can't know what it's like to be there, but I can know what it's like for me to think about trying to be there. So I'm a couple steps away, but I hope I've given us enough context to put us there as much as we can. So I want to think about what was it like for that woman? What was it like in the midst of incredible grief? She is walking, knowing her future is so uncertain, and then Jesus comes and interrupts it all. What would that have been like for her? I also find it really interesting that the young man isn't even the center of this story, just that he gets up and speaks. Jesus is the main player of this story. Another short aside as I was thinking about this passage, I hope we can all agree that the social setting that this woman finds herself is less than ideal. The fact that the structures that exist mean that a woman must contact society through a man, not ideal. But Jesus still works within that to better her situation immediately. He doesn't just give her some money or a house to make sure she's taken care of. Restoring her son changes her situation, even in the midst of a social structure that's not awesome. So this always encourages me to think when I am trying to make change in the world, as I know many of us here do, don't give up. Work in those situations. Make that immediate change for people. Knowing that Jesus is faithful in that. But think of the community aspect of what is changing for this woman. So the miracle of her son coming back to life, astounding. But the change of her immediate situation is what I'm really interested in. The larger implications, her connection to community is restored. This hits me because if you've ever asked me about it, a lot of my research focuses on belonging, inclusion, justice. I care really deeply about that. And I have the privilege of volunteering with an organization that supports adults with developmental disabilities to connect with their communities and build lives that they want. And in this organization, they have this saying that I just love. It's not a what question, it's a who question. So we say, what do you need? No, who do you need? Who do we need to connect you with for that to take shape in your life? It's because, yes, we have needs. We have whats. What? I need to pay my bills. I need to eat. I need to put gas in the car. That's my what. But I can have all of that met without belonging, without connection. No, I need who. I need connection. I need a community. And those whats get taken care of. In community, we serve each other and our needs are met. So connection in a person's life is so crucial, and I just love that this story demonstrates that. And this also leads me to think about loneliness. When we meet everybody's what needs, we can do that. But what if someone is so isolated? They can have all their needs met and be so lonely. And loneliness can be debilitating. I'm reading a book. It's actually the Lectures of Jean Vanier. He was creator of the L'Arche communities, if anyone's familiar. He's a Catholic theologian and philosopher. And he has these lectures that are made into a book called Becoming Human. And he writes about his experience at a psychiatric hospital. And this is what he says. Life no longer flows in recognizable patterns. For the person engulfed in this kind of loneliness, there's only emptiness, anguish, and inner agitation. There are no yearnings, no desires to be fulfilled, no desire to live. It is life turned in upon itself. Loneliness does that to people. And we need to care for one another so that that doesn't happen. Through a woman encounters Jesus, he experiences his faithfulness to her and faithful to provide for her through community. He restores her to community. This reminds me of Psalm 68, verses 4-6. Sing to God, sing praises to his name. Lift up a song to him who rides through the deserts. His name is the Lord, exalt before him. Father of the fatherless and protector of widows is God in his holy habitation. God settles the solitary in a home. He leads out the prisoners to prosperity. God cares about community. Not just provision, although God cares to provide for us, but family. To encounter Jesus is to encounter his faithfulness in community. Now imagine you were an onlooker. You heard the sounds of a funeral coming down your street. You'd heard about this woman who lost her son. And you come out to see and to join. And did you notice that their response was, they glorified God, saying, a great prophet has arisen among us. God has visited his people. The message of God's faithfulness was to them, not just to her, not just to him who was raised. They took it as a message of faithfulness to them as a group of God's people. As a nation, they were living occupied and oppressed by the Romans. So they're not free to practice their religion the way Yahweh clearly laid out for them. And in this instance, they see Yahweh visiting his people, demonstrating his faithfulness, returning to his people to deliver them. They saw promise of deliverance. Jesus was faithful to his mission on the earth to introduce the new age. Remember Mike's thing like this? The start of the new age. Starting the redemption of all things with his resurrection. God's faithfulness to his creation demonstrated in Jesus. The onlookers realized that in Jesus, God's faithfulness was being demonstrated to them. Big story. And this reminds me of Philippians 2. If you want to go there, Philippians 2, 6-11, if you want to follow along. Philippians 2, 6-11 starts, though he was in the form of God, he did not count equality with God a thing to be grasped, but emptied himself by taking the form of a servant, being born in the likeness of men. And being found in human form, he humbled himself by becoming obedient to the point of death, even death on a cross. Therefore, God has exalted him and bestowed on him the name that is above every name. So in the name of Jesus, every knee should bow in heaven and on earth and under the earth, and every tongue confess that Jesus Christ is Lord, to the glory of God the Father. Jesus was obedient to his mission. He was faithful to complete that on the earth. The faithfulness of Jesus Christ to begin the new age that starts the redemption of all things, starting with us. Hebrews 12:2 says, looking to Jesus, the founder and perfecter of our faith, for the joy that was set before him endured the cross, despising the shame, and is seated at the right hand of the throne of God. Jesus was faithful in his mission on the earth to do that. C.S. Lewis says, miracles are a retelling in small letters of the very same story which is written across the whole world in letters too large for some of us to see. We think of the miracles as the big things, but in this case, it's this miracle that is pointing us to the even bigger thing, the redemption of all things. But then I start to think about, was everybody thinking that as they were looking on? Was everybody excited about that? I wonder if there was any onlookers that were like, maybe a bit disappointed. I wonder if there was an onlooker who had already lost a family member of their own. Maybe there was even a widow who had lost their only son days before, weeks before, and Jesus wasn't there to interrupt that funeral procession. I wonder how that must have felt for that person. Jesus was not there to interrupt and change the tragedy of their situation. And as they're going through the struggle that came from their loss, not just the grief, but the social difficulty, they see someone else's situation radically rescued from that. And I wonder if they asked the question that I've asked, that many of us have asked. Where were you? Where were you when that was happening to me? It's that place of disappointment. And I think that this brings confusion, disappointment, maybe even jealousy. But the message for the disappointed onlooker is of future hope. That there is always something bigger to be pointed to if we let ourselves be. The faithfulness of Jesus Christ to set all things right. In Jesus, the redemption of humanity and the entire created world, for it to be renewed to how it is meant to be. Because in those deepest moments, the most painful moments of disappointment, we feel the world is not as it's supposed to be. It's not supposed to be this way. And in those moments, we can look to Jesus and know this is not the end of the story. When we are the disappointed onlookers, we need to allow ourselves to be pointed to that larger story, even when our own story is not encouraging. So the big picture is really important, to keep thinking about what God has started on the earth and what He's faithful to continue and complete. But I don't think we can stop there. Sometimes I think it's actually, for myself, it's easier to stay there. It's easier to stay in the place that says, no, I get this big picture. Eventually God will make everything right, and I'll just wait for that. But there's another piece there. The faithfulness of Jesus Christ and his faithfulness to you personally. That's that next step. I actually find it far more comfortable to stay in the big picture, especially when I'm disappointed, because then I don't have to confront those really hard places in my heart and admit that I'm disappointed. So what do we do then? How do we be renewed in our hope that Jesus is faithful to us individually? I don't have an easy answer, but I can say what I've been doing. Although hearing about the smaller instances in other people's lives, it can hurt. It's almost like, I pictured it like sandpaper on raw emotions. When you feel so deeply disappointed and then someone has a praise report, I just, okay. It hurts. But what I want to say is stay in there. Stay in there. You need to hear it. I need to hear it. Stay in those places where people are talking about the faithfulness of Jesus Christ to them. Even if you can't feel it on your own, stay in there. Listen to it through other people and his faithfulness to them. Allow it to renew your hope that he is also faithful to you individually, even if you can't see it right now. Stay in community. Stay where you can hear those messages. To encounter Jesus, even in a disappointment, is to be reminded of his faithfulness to set all things right, but also that he's faithful to us individually. He knows us, and he's committed to us even in that process. And for this, I turn to Romans 8, where all great things are. Starting at 18, going to 25. For I consider the sufferings of this present time are not worth comparing to the glory that is to be revealed to us. For the creation waits with eager longing for the revealing of the children of God. For the creation was subjected to futility, not willingly, but because of him who subjected it, in hope that the creation itself will be set free from its bondage to corruption and obtain the freedom of the glory of the children of God. For we know that the whole creation has been groaning together in the pains of childbirth until now. And not only the creation, but we ourselves, who have the first fruits of the Spirit, groan inwardly as we wait eagerly for adoption as sons and daughters, the redemption of our bodies. For in this hope we are saved. Now hope that is seen is not hope. For who hopes for what they see? But if we hope for what we do not see, we wait for it with patience. So in those times where you're not seeing it in your own life, wait for it with patience. And let those around you encourage you and remind you. So I hope I've convinced you today, even just a little bit more, of God's faithfulness to you. In that big picture and individually. And in closing, that's all I've got. I can welcome the worship team back up. How good is it to have Rach back? That just blessed me so much. Yay, Rachel. But as I invite her to come back, I wanted to ask you some questions to see how you're doing before we move into a time of response. I want to ask you, is there a place where God has intervened for you in your life, but you have not accepted that invitation to community? You're keeping it to yourself. If you're wondering if we want you here, we do. And if you're wondering if you can belong here, you can, just in case you needed to hear it officially. Have you ever witnessed or heard about how God has intervened in other people's lives, but you didn't take that opportunity to be reminded of that big picture faithfulness? That in itself are those small letters to see his faithfulness to his creation. When was the last time that God intervened in your life and you allowed it to renew that hope of that big picture? What about the places of disappointment you need to be honest about? Reminded of his personal faithfulness to you. Where in your life have you shielded and protected your disappointment from being exposed and confronted? And would you allow your community to love you through that today?